Today's project is going to be recutting the faceplate for my radio installation here in my nav station. As you can see, this panel's been cut out a few times, and I've had other radios in there, and it's beginning to look a little bit like Swiss cheese, and it really isn't very attractive. So it's time to go ahead and do this right. Now, I like the flush look of the radios, but my radios are not designed for flush mounting, so they don't have those face plates for flush mounting. So I've got to cut out neatly around each radio at the perfect size. Now, I've got 3 radios in here, and that's the problem, trying to get all 3 holes to line up perfectly. Okay, I'm using the old board as my base for doing this. As you can see, it's been cut out for other radios in the past, and I have rough cuts around these radios, so I'm going to use it. But if you didn't have this to start with, you could use a piece of Luan plywood or something like that. That would work out fine. What I'm going to do is take strips of Luan plywood, and I'll butt that tight up against the radio, and I'll box it in with other strips on the sides. Now, you could easily do this with pieces of cardboard if you were just going to mark your template, and even short pieces to go in there. They don't have to go the whole length if you're going to mark it and rescribe it. But I plan on using this one as a router template, so I want to actually run the router around there. So I want something fairly robust. So I'm going to go ahead and screw these in to this panel here and box all of the radios in nice and tightly. It'll take a little bit longer to do that, but when I go to make the panel, as you'll see later, I'll just be able to route the holes out, and I'll get nice clean holes with slightly radiused corners, which is perfect for how these radios work, and we'll look at that a little bit later on down the road. So let's start by going ahead and putting these strips in. Now, I can use one long strip on the bottom because all the radios are at the same height along the bottom line, so that's not a problem. Everywhere else, I'm going to have to custom fit the strips to it. First thing I'm going to do is secure this strip here, and I'll press it up fairly snugly against the radio. And as you can see, I've got this drill bit, which is a drill bit and countersink all in one. And the reason I'm going to countersink the screws is, once again, because I'm running a router over this and I want it all flush. And I just need a couple little screws in there to hold this nice and secure. Oops. There we go. And make sure the screws flush. And I want to place the screws kind of right under the radio. Okay, now I've cut these side strips, so I'll screw them in real quick. And you could also, if you were using this just as a marking pattern, you could hot melt glue these on here and speed things up. But once again, because I'm using this as a router pattern, I want to make sure everything's nice and firm and tight. And I will mention, this is one of my favorite handy tools, a little skill driver. I bought this for about 30 bucks, I think it was, somewhere in there. Has a lithium-ion battery, stays charged for a really long time. It's not fast or horribly powerful, but it does a pretty good job, and it's great for little tasks like this. You on. So that one. It is. All right, I've got all the radios boxed in, so to speak, with all of the plywood around there, and now I can just pop that off, and you can see I have got my template, and all I have to do now is take this to the shop, and we'll cut out these holes, and we'll have a perfect fit, in theory. Okay, back in the shop, we're ready to go ahead and start cutting our piece of plywood. But before I do that, I've got this teak trim on here, and I want to try to pop this off, hopefully without breaking it, so that I can reuse that, which will make life a little bit easier. And then I'll go ahead and cut my bulk piece out of this piece of plywood, And then after that, I'll glue the black Formica on it to give it a good finish. And finally, we'll route the holes out. So let's take it one step at a time, and let me try to get this thing off of here. Hopefully I can do this without really doing any damage, and yes, that'll come right off. Perfect. Pressure on there. I had a little bit of yellow glue on there, but it was not glued real tight, so. And perfect. So now I can pull the nails out of that and reuse it in here. Now I could tap them back out the way they went in. But the problem with that is sometimes you split that surface out. So what I'm going to do is just take a pair of vice grips and I'm going to pull them all the way through. And then I still have just a tiny hole on the surface, and I won't really damage my wood. Perfect. All right, now we got that piece of trim that we can reuse, so we'll set that aside for now. The next thing to do, so let's straighten up a little bit here, is go ahead and cut this piece of plywood to the correct width. And we'll do that on the table saw here. And just set that right in there. Make sure that's nice and straight, and then we'll just be able to run that piece of wood through the table saw. Okay, minor technicalities. Plug the saw in. I've got my board rough cut and ready to go, and I've rough cut a piece of black Formica to glue on there. So the next step is to go ahead and use some contact cement, and we're going to glue the two pieces together. And we'll just take a chip brush here and we'll put the contact cement on the Formica first. Nice heavy coat. Now I prefer to use the gel type contact cement. And the close up for the montage. And always do this where you have good ventilation. Okay, now we'll do the board. Okay, now we've got the board covered. We're going to let that dry. We'll let it dry on the Formica too. And then I'm going to second coat the wood, because the wood tends to soak the glue in a little bit. So I'm going to give that a second coat. Once all that's done and dry, then we can go ahead and mate the two pieces together and trim the outside edge of it, and then we'll cut our holes out. All right, now that the glue is dry, and the way you can tell if the glue is dry is you want it what they call tack free, which means you should be able to touch it and it not come away and stick to your finger, but at the same time still feel a little bit tacky and sticky. It's just kind of a narrow window there where before it gets too dry, it gets just dry enough. So you want to carefully put these pieces together, because as soon as that glue touches, it's going to stick. So you want to make sure you get that lined up properly, and that you've got all your edges covered all the way around, and that you don't have a bare edge exposed. And then you can press it down so that it starts to stick. Now if you were doing a bigger piece, you could slip another piece of wood underneath there so that you could work it out as you go and make sure you get it positioned correctly. But on a small piece like this, I can just lay it down. And we'll just go ahead and press that down in there by hand. And once we get that pressed down in there, I'm going to use a laminate roller to roll that down. If you don't have a laminate roller, you can go ahead and use just a rubber mallet to tap it down really good. But the laminate roller works pretty good, and I happen to have one. So you just want to put nice even pressure on there and get that stuck down real good. Also helps if you have it fully on the bench. Okay, we've got that stuck real good. So the next step is going to be to go ahead and route the edges. And I've got my little trim router here, and I've got a laminate trim bit in here, and it's got a bearing on the end, and it's called a laminate flush or a laminate trim, just to trim those edges, and the bearing will ride around the plywood and cut that off nice and flush all the way around. So I'll show you how to do that. And we'll just start on one edge and we'll just run the laminate trimmer all the way around as we go. And here's a little tip also. It helps to use a little bit of WD-40 on the bearing as you go. That prevents the glue from clogging up the bearing and causing the bearing to seize. All right, I've got the Formica glued on there. We've got our blank slate. We're ready to go. We're ready to start cutting our holes out. Now I could just do a plunge router and route the hole out using this template, but I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and mark it and do a rough cut with the jigsaw first. That takes some of the load off of the router when I'm cutting it, so all I'm doing is cutting an edge. And my experience is that just makes it a little easier to get a nice clean cut. When you're doing a plunge cut with a router, unless you can really hold everything very firmly, you tend to get a little bit of chatter in there and it creates some problems. So it's just easier all around if all I'm doing is trimming the hole and not doing all of the cutting with the router. So I'm going to do that first. So what we'll do is we'll flip this over and I'm going to mark it on the back side. The reason I'm going to mark it on the back side, and I'll just mark that full size hole in there, and I'll cut that smaller than that. The reason I'm going to do it on the back side is when the saber saw cuts in and out, it cuts on the upstroke. And if I were to cut this on the face of it, that has the side that has the Formica, as that bit comes up, it can chip the Formica. So if I do it from the back side as it comes up, it doesn't chip the Formica, and it just makes things look a little bit easier, nicer and cleaner. So let's go ahead and I'm going to drill holes in here and cut that out with the saber saw, and then we'll go ahead and route it. Now we've got a couple of choices when it comes to routing, and I haven't quite figured out exactly how I'm going to approach this. We've got two different types of bits here. We've got a bit with the bearing on the bottom and a bit with the bearing on the top. And I can use this template either way, routing around with the bit on the bottom or the bearing on the top. Now, although I said I was going to cut it from the back side, I want to drill the holes from the front side. Because obviously, as you know, as you punch a hole through, it tends to explode out on the back side. So once again, we don't want to damage the laminate or chip it or anything. So I'm going to drill the holes from the face side. I've got the holes cut, and it's time to go ahead and use the saber saw to do the rough cutout. So we'll just simply cut in between the holes, staying fairly well inside of the lines so that we got plenty of room to work with there. And I will put on my hearing protection for this. Okay, now that I've got this rough cut out, it's time to sprout the final pass on this, and then we'll be done with this in the shop. So I'm going to lay the pattern down on the back side of it, and when I route it out, I'm going to route it out from this side, and I'm going to use the pattern with the bottom bearing on the router bit, and I think that's going to work out best. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and clamp this pattern down nice and tight on here so that it doesn't slip while I'm routing it. And I'll just use basic C-clamps for doing that. And I'll put a couple on each end. And the clamps may get in the way while I'm routing it, and if they do, I'll have to shift them and move them, but I'm going to try to place them so that they won't get in the way. And I want to be pretty careful that I've got this thing lined up pretty well with the edges and everything is nice and straight, because
this is going to be it. This is the final cut. And if I screw up now, then we've really screwed up and we'll have to start over again, which we really do not want to do. And we'll just snug them up, not too tight, but tight enough that they're not going to slip. And now we can route from this side to trim out this wood, and the bearing will ride on the pattern on the back side. Okay, when I set this up, I want to set it so that the depth here is just enough to have the bearing just below the surface of the wood so that it'll ride on the pattern on the other side. And in theory, we won't screw it up. Okay, now we take the clamps off, and there we have it, our piece to match our pattern. So now all we have left to do is clean up this horrendous mess and head on back down to the boat and do the final fitting down there. Okay, now back on the boat, it's time to see if this actually fits and all our hard work is paid off. And we've got a reasonably good fit. I think we're a little tight on the radio, and I can feel we're kind of, it's not pushing in at the top. It's because the radio's not, it's got a little bit of a taper to it up here. I think I'm going to back taper this edge here so that as I push the panel in, it'll fit a little bit better. And we'll do that with just the little mushroom grinder. Okay, I'm going to use my little mushroom grinder here on my angle drill in order to put a bit of a back bevel on the back side of this. Now, I'm not going to change the shape of the original hole, but just kind of bevel that back at an angle so that the inside of the hole is wider than the front side of the hole. And this should allow the panel to sit in there a little bit better. And also because the radios themselves are not quite absolutely square, they kind of taper up to a slightly larger size. So this should provide me with a pretty good fit. As you can see now, I've got a nice bevel cut on the back side of this all the way around, so that should fit in there better. Oh yes, much better. That fits right in there now. So I'm going to do a couple of final cleanups, and then we should be done with this project. All right, I'm going to do two final things to finish up the fit on this. Now, I know it fits the radios nice, and I just want to do a little bit of cleaning up. So I've got this coarse sandpaper that I've glued to a little block of wood, and I'm just going to use that to go around the edges and just break off any sharp spots. And also when I routed it, it leaves just a slight little bit of ripple. So by coming across it like this, just a little bit of back and forth, that cleans up some of that ripple. And finally, what I'm going to do, one last trick, and I'm just going to mark the edge of the plywood with a little black marker there. What that does is help the edge just disappear into the blackness of the black Formica and the radio. So you won't have this white outline that will shine out a little bit. Now you could use black paint for this, that'd work fine. I find a marker works good, it's easy, I don't have to screw around with any paint or anything. All right, well that finishes up this project. I've installed my mic clips on here so that I have a place to hang my microphones. I've added a couple little screws at each end to hold it in place, and I've used screws with black heads so they pretty much disappear. And I've also added these drawer wire pulls that give it kind of an electronics tech rack look to it. So I hope you've gained something from watching me do this project and maybe learned a thing or two that'll help you working on your boat.
As always, if you've liked the video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and click like on the video. Comments are welcome. If you feel like you've gotten something out of this video and it's been valuable to you, or any of my other videos have been valuable to you, I would really appreciate it if you would post a donation either via PayPal or through my Patreon page. I spend a lot of time and money on these videos, and every little bit of extra I get helps. I'm not a rich person, I own a boat, and it sucks up all my money, and I'm doing this to help fund my boat project. So I appreciate you watching. Until next time, I'm Captain Wayne, wishing you fair winds and following seas.